Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest is Jon S. Kulaga, president of Indiana Wesleyan University. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, glad to be here. Great to be here.
As a college student, rumor has it on campus that you may have served as a DJ at what is now Spring Arbor University's SAU radio. Now, I've searched for recordings of your programmings, and alas, I'm going to need to depend upon you for your honest cooperation in terms of those details. But first, would you please confirm your service as a DJ and what led you to serve in such a capacity?
Yeah, well, yes, I can confirm that was one of my jobs on campus. I was the disc jockey. And that was back in the day, 1980, when we actually spun real vinyl. I mean, it wasn't programmed and it wasn't automated. I had to work both turntables. So yeah, that's true. What really happened was two very pragmatic things. One is, as a high school kid at my local church, me and my best friend, I think we partly did it to get out of sitting with our parents, but we ran the sound for our church, and it was up in the balcony. So we were behind our parents. But we were trained by a guy there's a series of radio stations in Michigan called Family Life Radio. And he was one of their engineers, and he attended our church. And so he helped my roommate and I, my best friend at the time, get our FCC license, and which was a bigger deal than it is today. Yeah. We had to be able to make calculations and calculate megahertz and all that kind of stuff. And so we got all that as high school students, preparation for college. And then when we landed in college, I needed a couple jobs to pay for school. And so part of my employment was at the radio station, and the other one was I was the mail carrier. We didn't have trucks. We walked the mail around to all the offices. And it started the first day on campus. The very first day, as a freshman, we attended a meeting for all those who were interested. And we walked in and it was Friday. It was Friday night. We had the meeting and we had our licenses, which they couldn't believe, but it was because of our friend. And none of the upperclassmen wanted to work 10 to midnight. The station went off at midnight. And so they said, well, why don't you guys work it? And it literally took both of us to, like, one turn the record on and one turn the other one off. And it took both of us to do those 2 hours. I think I sweat through my shirt. All 12 people listening, right? Yeah, so we started from day one, my freshman year, working there.
Yeah, that's great. Now, DJs often have stage names, and I believe your tenure on the air there at Spring Arbor then would have paralleled, for example, a television show that has sort of become a cult classic out there, WKRP in Cincinnati. I think it ran from 79 to 82, which had DJs by the name of Dr. Johnny Fever, Venus Flytrap. By chance, did you have a stage name?
I did not. I was probably looked more like Dr. Johnny Fever, and I had the voice of Venus Flytrap. So, no, I did not. It was still a Christian school. They didn't know, the fact that they let us play Christian rock and roll was already a big deal. They weren't going to let you get too crazy on the air.
Now, if you were thinking the way musical tastes change over time, but some things become classics then, if you were to play music from that tenure in time when you were on the air, at home, what would you proudly play to this day?
Today? What I proudly play today?
Yeah. What would you proudly still claim and potentially has classic status?
Oh, well, classic status would be Petra. This is the early beginnings. I mean, Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill still had a following in 1980. Larry Norman was still doing live concerts. Why don't you look into Jesus? He's got the answer. I mean, so some of the pioneers were still there. This was the beginning of Amy Grant. This was the beginning of Stephen Curtis Chapman. Brian Duncan was still singing for Sweet Comfort Band. He hadn't broken off and gone solo. Second chapter of Acts. The Imperials, and that's hardly Christian rock, but again, these are the forefront people. Sweet Comfort Band. Just trying to think of Res Band. First was Resurrection Band, but then they shortened it to Res Band. Yeah, these are all the ones that. Now, I played Stryper, but I wouldn't necessarily call them classic. The Bumblebee Outfits. I mean, I think they were the sort of the Christian alternative to Kiss.
Yep.
I think that's what they were trying to accomplish. Whiteheart was out there for a period of time. Those are all what we were allowed to do at the station, and it was WSAE. I think they may have changed the moniker now. It's 89.3 WSAE. It rhymed. And it was an education band, so there were no commercials. And they basically had a very straight, sort of not exhilarating program. From 10 to midnight turned out to be a lot of symphonies, and helped me get my homework done because they were hour-long reels, and it helped the elderly who were listening to go to sleep. But for 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the afternoon, we could break away from our format and play whatever we wanted, as long as it was Christian.
Yeah.
And so the show was called Breakaway.
Yeah.
And that's where I got to talk. I got to, I was live. I wasn't just turning the news on, turning the news off, turning the reel on. That was 19 to 20 hours of the programming.
Right.
But that section of Breakaway is what I live for in terms of being able to really, I could take calls from the residence halls and play music. So that, I had freedom to play, whatever I wanted.
That's great. Now, since you mentioned them, I've got to ask, Stryper has a 40th anniversary tour coming up here this year. And for younger individuals who aren't familiar with Stryper or think this may be in any way some figment of my imagination here, there's a website out there with details for this tour. Rumor has it maybe you secured tickets. Do you care to deny or confirm this rumor?
Well, I can deny it because I'm looking at 65-year-old men in yellow tights. Can you imagine Jerry Garcia in a yellow onesie spandex? I mean, it's just not going to be a pretty tour. It's just not going to be a pretty tour. So no, I'm staying away from that one.
Denied owning tickets. Then. Got it.
Can't get you tickets, and I'm not even trying to get tickets.
Now, I asked you which music you would proudly still play in your home with your family or guests to this day. Are there things that you played back in the day that you'd never play again?
Well, I didn't really enjoy Res Band. I didn't enjoy Stryper. They were, there were a lot of these one-hit wonder groups that came out. I wasn't a big David Meese fan. I don't know if you remember that name. He was sort of the Barry Manilow of Christian music. There always seemed to be like an alternative. If you like, it's like those Cologne kiosks in the mall that are fake. If you like this, you'll love this. And so, if you like Kiss, you'll love Stryper. If you like Barry Manilow, you'll love David Meese. And we also played a lot of there were throughout other, not Breakaway, because we really focused on this is like we're breaking away.
Yeah.
But there were other times we got to play a lot of Southern gospel.
Okay.
So we did a lot of Southern gospel at other formats, other times of the day.
Yeah.
I like the cathedrals, but I'm not a huge Southern gospel fan.
Okay.
And maybe it's because I played so much of it.
Listen to hours and hours of it during your formative years.
There were a lot of alternative rock bands that were just trying to carve out a niche.
Yeah.
I love DeGarmo and Key. I mean, that was one of the groups that I really enjoyed. That was back in the day when it was like $5 to get a ticket, and it was everything was general admission. There were no like reserve seats, and you'd stand outside and they'd let the doors open, and people would jump on the backs of chairs and run on the backs of chairs down to get a good seat because there was no first class tickets.
Yeah.
They were playing I mean, I remember going to see second chapter of Acts over at Eastern Michigan University on the campus of Eastern Michigan, Ypsilanti, and it was crazy. I mean, people were throwing coats but it was $5,
Yeah.
and it was sold out, but no special seats for anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah. Thank you. On a slightly more serious note, then, in what ways did serving as a DJ allow you to communicate with your fellow students there on campus and foster within you a sense of involvement with the Spring Arbor community?
Well, you do, because we were an educational band on the radio. We didn't have commercials, but we had public service announcements.
Mhm.
So we did a lot of PSAs, and I got to know a lot of what was going on in the community just because I was reading them. And then we would receive requests to play, and we were very much aware that a large retirement facility, all stages of care surrounded the outskirts of the Spring Arbor campus.
Mm.
And so we knew who the larger listening audience was.
Yeah.
They probably turned the radio off during breakaway and then turned it back on. And so there was lots of promotions of what the campus was. We would promote the campus events on the radio. I don't know if the students were like always tuning in or anything, but I was aware of when I was in the game room or different places, especially during that breakaway format, the school was playing it, and you could see it. You could hear it in different places around campus.
Yeah.
And so, I was very cognizant of the fact that, I mean, I'm not saying I was the spokesman, but people were listening,
Mhm.
and I had a responsibility to make sure that I was representing the university well when the microphone was on.
Yeah.
I was aware that it was more than just me, even though you're alone in the room.
Yeah.
And that's probably the most difficult thing, is that you're alone in the room and you're surrounded by nobody, but you've got to generate this excitement and this enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And, you hear the DJs on the radio and they just sound so up. And I can visualize you're alone. There's nobody, and you may have two people in the morning, but a lot of times back then it was just one person.
Yeah.
And you're trying to generate all this in a soundproof room.
Yeah.
So, but you're aware of the responsibility, and that I was able to communicate back and forth. And of course we get requests, and that was always fun.
Yeah. What are some of the additional communication lessons you learned during your college years serving in such a role that perhaps you carry with you to this day even?
Well, one of the communication skills that you develop as I don't even know if they call them disc jockeys anymore, as a radio personality, is that you have to do multiple things. That and being a youth pastor were probably two of the most formative skills training for being a public speaker, because you are with your left hand turning this volume down and shutting this turntable off. At the same time, you're having to turn this volume up and start this turntable on your right while you are reading the weather and watching the clock.
Yeah.
And so, you have to be, because on the back of the cover of the LP, every song had how long the song was, but it also had it handwritten 19 seconds before the lyrics start.
Yeah.
So you knew if you were talking the song down and then talking this one on, you had 19 seconds before the lyrics started, and you never talk over the lyrics of a song. And so you're watching the clock, you're doing this, you might be reading a PSA, and you're doing all those things simultaneously. And that's why my first night took two of us to do it.
Yeah.
But eventually you become really good at it and you're very comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And as a public speaker, communicating, you've got a lot of things that are going on in terms of reading the audience, knowing your notes, knowing where you're going.
Yeah.
Maybe the slides aren't working. You're reacting to whether or not you feel like the audience is with you or not. There's a lot of things that go on inside the head of somebody who's speaking publicly. And that 4 years really honed that ability to do multiple things while you're talking. Because you have to talk the whole time, right? I mean, so it's not like you can do all those things quietly. You've got to be reading something or talking.
Yeah.
And that was really helpful.
Yeah.
The other thing that I found, the other job, just real quickly, I was a mail carrier. So my responsibility was, I had two, I don't know if you remember the very large briefcases that slide projectors and carousels used to be in.
Oh, yeah.
This is like a dinosaur conversation. But that's what we packed all the mail in for the offices. And I would deliver the mail to the offices and also collect their mail and then bring it back to the mailroom. That gave me a great exposure to the entire campus. It also kept me in shape because I climbed lots of stairs. But that I took away from that, I knew so many staff, and it gave me a great appreciation for all the people who make the university work.
Yeah.
That are not necessarily honored and not necessarily seen.
Yeah.
And I carry that with me to today. I always challenge our people. Do you know the person who cleans your building?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know their name? The person who you swipe your ID and see at the cafeteria every single day. Do you know her name? Do you know what she's going through? Have you prayed with her?
Yeah.
The dishwasher, the person who's doing the salad bar. There's so many people, the facilities person. You walked in and we know how to complain if the sidewalk wasn't shoveled off. We know how to do that, but do you know the person who actually shoveled your sidewalk?
Right.
So I got to see a lot of those people. I had to walk all the way to the facilities, which was, further away. It was always across the street and down the road because that's where the fleet of cars was. So I had to walk there. So I got to know the facilities people. And it just engendered within me this great appreciation of all the different entities that have to be mission focused and mission driven if the university is ever going to get out of Dodge and do the thing for which they were called.
Yeah.
And so that I kind of got that as a mail carrier.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That's a great experience, especially to have that as a student.
Yeah.
I want to transition now to asking you some broader biographical details. When you were not on the air, you earned an undergraduate degree in youth ministry from Spring Arbor, then also earned a master's degree in higher education from Michigan State and a PhD in higher education from Kansas State. You were ordained to the ministry by the Free Methodist Church and recently transferred your ordination to the Wesleyan Church. Would you share a little bit about how you discerned your calling to serve the university as well as the church and how the two relate?
Yeah. So serving the church came first for no other good reason except that I loved art and I was really good at math. And my brother was in college to be an architect. I too was going to be an architect. That was probably the sum total of my thought process in high school. But the summer going into my senior year, we had a regular tradition back in the day where you'd go to camp meeting and you'd go to summer camp. And I had just a significant recommitment. There were some things going on in my family. My dad used to be the superintendent of schools, and he had left after 2 heart attacks to go into the ministry in the inner city of Pontiac. And as my senior year, and I was graduating valedictorian, if things continued to go well, and we were going to be living apart. We were going to be living over 100 miles away, and I would travel down and see him my parents on the weekend. So there were a lot of things going, but I had a significant encounter, recommitment. At that time, felt called into the ministry. And I felt, because of my camping experience and I'd been working at summer camps, I felt youth ministry was where I needed to go. So I went to Spring Arbor, changed my plans, went to Spring Arbor and entered into the youth ministry program, graduated, and went out to Kansas at a Free Methodist church in McPherson, Kansas to be the youth pastor. And it was a church of about 1,000, had maybe 120 kids in my youth group, and 7th through 12th grade, and did that. Met my wife. She was coming home from Kansas State at the time, and we met and got married. But after about 3 or 4 years, I had been an RA at Spring Arbor. I'd been in student affairs work. I've been around student affairs work as a student. And I felt like maybe the 7th graders and the 8th graders weren't really my niche. Loved them individually, but, maybe not 40 of them together. I thought, maybe college work is where I need to go. Maybe it's student affairs, calling for sure, but maybe not the church. And I was being pressured at that point gently, and I don't blame anybody, but, they were pushing me into, you need to take a church, you need to take a church. And I know, they had pulpits that were empty and that's not what I felt called to. And so that's where I started to really feel like yes to the students, but maybe not to local church per se.
Mm.
And so I moved, and I had been ordained at that point in the church. So I moved into Christian higher education, went back to Spring Arbor and started my career in student affairs. And that's where I got my master's from Michigan State. But that's where I started to discern the call. And, where they are complementary, of course, is student formation, spiritual formation in the life of the student. And so, I felt like we were absolutely a complementary ministry to what was going on in the church. Back then, the churches the emphasis was the fact that the churches were sending their kids to the school. I feel like today we're probably doing the opposite. We're sending our graduates back to the church. We're training up an educated, faithful laity to sustain the population, the congregations of the church. And so they're complementary, but where they are different, though, is that, universities are not churches. And we can talk more about that later on, I think. But, they have a different focus. We aren't a camp meeting. We aren't a camp. We aren't a church. We are an academic community. And the life of the mind, loving the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. The church may focus more on the soul and the spirit, not that they don't focus on the mind, but I think the Christian university that's faithful to the Word of God really has an ability to have a huge impact on the intellectual capabilities of the mind. And so it has a complementary but different ministry.
Thank you. In addition to serving in a variety of professional capacities at Spring Arbor, you also served at Asbury University as the chief academic officer. And then between your time at Asbury and then accepting the appointment as president at Indiana Wesleyan University, served at Ohio Christian University as their chief officer. Would you please describe the discernment process that eventually led you to accept the appointment as president of Indiana Wesleyan?
Again, lifetime career. I'm in my 37th year in terms of serving a CCCU school. So I've committed my career to Christian higher education. I hadn't really looked anywhere outside of that. I'm theologically Wesleyan. So I would need to be able to function within that theological framework. I'm not sure that there are some wonderful, faithful Christian schools of a different denomination. I'm not sure they'd be interested in me because if you look at my resume, it's pretty obvious, my theological preferences. The lens through which I read scripture. At Spring Arbor, and I was working in the academic field. I was over their degree completion campuses. There were 14 of them at the time. In 2006. I had some different people speak into me about the fact that maybe I was cut out for a provost academic. Maybe I should be leading in that way. So I had people speak into me in terms of leadership ability. And I had been a vice president for development at Spring Arbor for 4 years, but really enjoyed that meeting with alumni. But that's a grind. You're on the road a lot, lots of pressure in terms of actual dollars. And then it goes back to zero July 1. And what are you going to do for me this year? But really the life of the mind, the integration of faith and learning was something that has just been ingrained in me and I love. And so that's what led me to the opportunity at Asbury. And I would say, in terms of discerning the call, and I would like to talk specifically about Indiana Wesleyan, but really the convergence of, Frederick Buechner talks about vocation being where the world's great need meets with your greatest joy. That's a loose rendering of his quote. But the idea of what brings you joy and what does the world need? Well, what brings me joy and what does the school need? At the time, Asbury needed in 2007, they had no online programs. They were in a little bit of a situation that was financially not great. They'd had an interim president. I had done a lot of adult learning. And so this was something that I could bring to that school. At Ohio Christian, again, that was a school that was denominationally owned. Asbury's independent, so there's no denomination affiliation. Asbury had a denomination, but again, it was Wesleyan. It was holiness. It was a smaller school. They had some needs at the time that I could help fulfill. And at that time, I was thinking, I'd been a provost's chief academic officer for 10 years, and this was a smaller school in Ohio. It brought me closer to my elderly parents who were in Michigan. And I thought this might be the opportunity. The one with Indiana Wesleyan is really interesting because by the time we came to Indiana Wesleyan and the opportunity arose in the January of 2022, the announcement came out that the president here was retiring soon. We had been at 5. We had been at Michigan, we'd been at Kansas, we had been at Kentucky, and we'd been in Ohio. The packing up and moving was not something that we always look forward to. So I would, in the words of C.S. Lewis, I was the most reluctant candidate when it came to Indiana Wesleyan because I said, Lord, I have an outgoing personality. I interview well. I can think on my feet. I can get myself a job that you don't want, and I can kick down a door that maybe you're not calling me to. So just by virtue of maybe force of personality or whatever, I saw it and I was super interested. I've been sort of gravitationally revolving around Indiana Wesleyan, for my entire life, so I was very aware. One of the dean for the School of Education at Asbury was a Marian College alum. So, I couldn't escape Indiana Wesleyan no matter where I went. But I said, Lord, I don't want to do this if it's not your will. So people know me. They know my background. They know where I'm at. If you can have the heart of kings in your hand, you can have the heart of a search committee. Yeah. And I'm not contacting him. So, January turned to February turned to maybe early March, and the deadline was approaching, and the headhunter, the firm that they'd hired, called me and said, how come you haven't applied? And I said, how come you haven't asked? And he said, I've sent you 2 times. He says, check your junk mail, your spam mail. Yeah. And there were 2 times that he had personally reached out to me and asked if I would apply. And I said, okay. He goes, the deadline's tomorrow. He goes, I got to have a letter from you at least showing interest. So I went in, cleaned up the letter. I hadn't really updated my resume. So I did a real quick thing there, and I got it off that night and made the deadline. And then I let it go. I said, Lord, I'm in. If you want me to have it, I'm not gonna worry about it. Yeah. Another month goes by or so, and I get a contact. That if you make the top 7, these numbers are fudgy, but if you make the top 7, you have to have a personal interview with the owner of the headhunting firm, search firm. I said, great. Get a call a little bit later. Hey, you're in the top 7. Great. I had a 2-hour phone call. Let it go. Have not talked to my wife about this. Have not mentioned this at all to Lena. We have all of our adult children living 30 miles away.
I was going to say, in the household where I live, that's living dangerously.
It's an emotional roller coaster, as you know. When you're going, you have to picture yourself there. They want your educational philosophy. You've got to write all this stuff, and you have to put yourself in that position, metaphorically, to feel what you would, and I just wasn't going to take her on that roller coaster ride until it meant something. So we got to be Memorial Weekend, and I got a phone call that I was one of the 4 finalists, and I'd have to drive to Indianapolis for an in-person interview at like June 6th, 7th, 8th. So in 10 days, I was going to be in Indianapolis interviewing. I thought, you know what, I should probably include Lena in this conversation because now it's getting serious. Yeah. And she had known the discontent and that I was looking and, feeling the need to, and she's been with me the whole way. So I had always felt called, but I just didn't want to push. And it wasn't, I'm confident, but I wasn't an ego thing where it was like, you know where I'm at, you can call me. No, it was just like, I was almost a Gideon type of a thing where, Lord, you can do this. I have faith that you can bring my name to somebody's mind. Yeah. And so all along the way, I held it very lightly, and until it finally just materialized. So, and again, where I'm in another Wesleyan institution, I've served my entire career, except for a short stint at Kansas State, which is theologically nothing. All the schools I've served have been theologically in the Wesleyan family.
Yeah. Along those lines, then, in terms of understanding that particular family theologically, amongst your numerous books include Edward Payson Hart, Second Man of Free Methodism, and Cornerstones of Spiritual Vitality toward an understanding of Wesleyan spirituality in Christian higher education. When you think about the Wesleyan Arminian theological tradition, What commitments do you believe prove most critical in terms of how colleges and universities such as Spring Arbor, Asbury, Indiana Wesleyan, et cetera, understand themselves and then put those commitments into action in curricular and co-curricular programs?
Yeah, well, that's a whole day. Yeah, that's part of the whole reason we do things.
Right.
Briefly, separate from maybe what all schools do. I think there are wonderful schools in the Council of Christian Colleges, and that all do wonderful at integrating faith and learning from their perspective. And so, and we've got schools, if you know Indiana and the I-69 corridor, the Holy Corridor. We've got wonderful schools between Indianapolis and Michigan that all accurately and effectively talk about integration of faith and learning. So that's not unique to the Wesleyan Arminian tradition. What the Wesleyans tend to bring is a more emphasis on personal holiness. We were part of a holiness movement. I'm not sure there's a movement anymore. Certainly there are churches and denominations that still emphasize this idea of not only just social holiness, but personal holiness.
Mm-hmm.
But that conjunctive theology that Paul Chilcolt writes about in some of his writings, that both and. We were talking earlier before we went on that the Reformed and Calvinist tradition follows the tree up to John Calvin, and he wrote the Institutes, which is a more systematic theology. We follow our tree up, our branch to the trunk of John Wesley. He didn't write an Institutes, he wrote a journal.
Mm-hmm.
He worked his theology out in his sermons and in his journal. And you can see that also in the writings and the sermons of Francis Asbury, who he sent to the United States. And again, horseback rider, writing his sermons out. So this idea of working it out is a little more messy, a little more sloppy, but it's this both and. It's head and heart. It's personal holiness and social holiness. Charles Wesley wrote the hymn, Unite the Two So Long Disjoined, knowledge and vital piety. It's both. Knowledge puffs up. Well, that's why you need to connect it with vital piety, with spiritual formation. And I think the Wesleyan tradition does a really good job. And the other thing I think the Wesleyan tradition, the Wesleyan theological lens, besides the holiness, a couple of things. One is we have a great emphasis on sanctification, which is part of the holiness, but it's not just about getting saved. That's the bottom rung of the ladder. That's not the end all be all. With our lack of emphasis on any kinds of eternal security, we do believe that your relationship with Christ is secure as long as you continue to pursue him. So we don't focus a lot on that aspect. What we focus in on is, okay, now that you're saved, really it's kind of just begun. And now you have a lifetime of being conformed into his image. Yeah. And so there's so much wonderful, the optimism of grace in the Wesleyan theological tradition, where, grace is not only something grace is not just something that God does to you and for you and in you. Grace is a power that he wants to emanate through you. So you have the great Wesleyan movement of the Salvation Army. William Booth was a Methodist, but he was a Wesleyan, maybe a Shiite Wesleyan. I mean, he was hardcore. But that idea that, yes, because of what God's grace has done in me and for me and to me, in terms of transforming me every day into more and more and more in the likeness of Christ in this life, not the next, but his grace can also be operating through me. Yeah. And so a lot of your social ministries, a lot of that emphasis on making a difference in the culture, in society, that's that personal holiness and social holiness. I think that's a defining characteristic, I think, of a lot of Wesleyan ministries and a lot of Wesleyan denominations. And hopefully, our moniker at Indiana Wesleyan is World Changers. That is a shorthand for what I just said. Yeah. Because all of what I just said can't get put on a billboard, but it's world changers. Because of what God has done in me and for me and to me, I have a responsibility to go out, and he's going to do through me and change the world. That other Christian colleges would say the same thing, but I think with the optimism that we have, the optimistic view we have of grace, where When we read John 3:16, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever," that's a legitimate offer to every single human being. You have not been not chosen. That's a legitimate offer. I think that's a very optimistic. It does God's reputation very well.
Yeah.
That he's making a legitimate offer to literally everybody.
Thank you.
So,
In terms of that grace-filled optimism that animates Wesleyan institutions of higher education, what do you see as their greatest contributions that they can make in the future to church and society as we're moving forward?
well, there have been some authors who have said, the problem with the evangelical mind is that there isn't one.
Mm.
I think that's a little harsh. I think, there have been wonderful people. I mean, going all the way back again, John Wesley was Oxford trained, so he wasn't, lacking an academic pedigree. But I think, again, our contribution, there's a couple things. I think a lot of the Wesleyan institutions have continued to stay very, very true to a biblical worldview, where a lot of your other mainline churches who may have more of a life of the mind
Mm-hmm.
have walked away from the heart and walked away or misinterpreted what the heart means, and have compromised on many cultural issues. I'm not talking about Christian nationalism, but I'm talking about a biblical worldview that holds a biblical perspective on human sexuality, on marriage, on family. A lot of your Wesleyan schools are holding the line on that kind of a thing. I think we need to, what I would like to see, and what we're trying to do at Indiana Wesleyan, is also just make sure that we are doing our part to enter into the life of the mind, to really contribute intellectually. I think, the schools that trace their theological heritage to people like Jonathan Edwards or John Calvin, they've had this longer tradition of actual intellectual contribution. And I think, a school the size of Indiana Wesleyan and the quality of the faculty that we have, we need to be part of that as well. We need to be contributing to the church, to the larger capital C church, to help us think well. Harry Blameyer's, friend of C.S. Lewis, talked about, if we just think we can cultivate souls and not the mind, we're going to see some dire results. Again, that's a shorthand of a longer quote. But, people like him, people like Arthur Holmes with the idea of the Christian college, I think there are people who've written about this. And from the Wesleyan perspective, again, we have something to offer. We have a lens through which we interpret scripture. And I think that voice needs to be multiplied tenfold in service of not only the church, but also society.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. As our time unfortunately begins to become short, I want to turn now to asking you about the Christian academic vocation then. And in your opinion, as a university president, what qualities and our characteristics are definitive of the Christian academic vocation?
I don't know where you want to go with that one. Again, I think that the Christian college, the Christian academic vocation, but the Christian university, we have a very unique community. There are some covenantal schools where everybody, including the students, have to sign that they're Christian, and there are more missional schools where it's the faculty and staff that have to sign it, but not the students. But where the majority of the students are Christian, but you don't have to sign that. But either way, you are signing one thing or the other, that you are committed to the mission and the values and the lifestyle of that school. You don't do something like that at state universities. So we really focus on community, developing community, but around the mission. So missional alignment is one of those values, commitment to and alignment with the institution's mission and values, I think are emphasized far more, and rightfully so, at a Christian university, as opposed to, I don't know if you have to sign something at Ohio State that you are committed to the land grant vision of the university, or Michigan State or Kansas State, But here we take our values, our biblical worldview, our lifestyle commitments very seriously. Beyond that, I think there are things like we talked about in terms of curiosity, intellectual curiosity, this ability of being open-minded, be able to learn new things. But all of that comes back to your intellectual curiosity, critical thinking. All those things come back to, what does it say in Scripture?
Hmm.
Because if you're open to everything, if you're open to anything, you fall for everything.
Yeah.
Kind of a saying. But we always bring it back to the Word of God and the work of Christ, and that is a virtue and a skill that we need new professors coming in to our universities to be able to hold. I say here at Indiana Wesleyan, we don't follow a donkey, we don't follow an elephant, we follow a lion and a lamb.
Mm.
We are interested in the politics of things as much as we are interested in how those things are informed by Scripture.
Mm. Mm.
And that ability, that discipline, that perseverance, that diligence to do the hard work of saying, how does this square with Scripture,
Yeah.
is really just so needed in the academy today.
Yeah. You echoed a couple of the virtues that you believe are essential for the exercise of the Christian academic vocation. In the age in which we live, are there any vices, do you think, that we need to be vigilant against that can be damaging or problematic in terms of the full exercise of the Christian academic vocation?
Well, one of the vices is allowing a political party to do your thinking for you.
Hmm.
I think there are Christian colleges who love policies of a certain political party or presidential administration, and they wrap themselves around that too tightly.
Yeah.
They lose their prophetic voice in the process. We hear warnings about Christian nationalism all the time, and we also hear warnings about secular globalism all the time. And I think there are Christian colleges, because of certain commitments, lean one way or lean the other. Both are dangerous. And depending on what group you track in, you'll hear more about one than the other. But I think that's a particular vice, is when you delegate your commitments and your thinking and to a third party, and you aren't doing the hard work yourselves. It's easier to just receive it and then indoctrinate. We're not in the indoctrination business, but we are in the education business. But we're in the education business from a biblical worldview. Yeah. And so when we forfeit that, then we become generic and we've lost our purpose for existing.
Yeah. Thank you. For our last question then today, I want to ask you about the relationship that the university shares with the church. We've talked about this in various ways through the course of our conversation, but I want to frame it this way in particular, in the sense that, in what ways, if any, is the health of the Christian academic vocation as we exercise on our campuses related to the health of the relationship that the church and the church-related universities share?
Well, there's no doubt that there's some kind of a symbiotic relationship that exists. Now, at Indiana Wesleyan, we are owned by our denomination. At other schools, you're affiliated.
Yeah.
So, in the one hand, an affiliated school, and then there's truly just independent. So you've got wonderful Christian schools that are completely independent. I've served at one of those. You've got some that are affiliated. I've served at my alma mater and is affiliated, not owned, and this one is owned. So that relationship becomes much more intertwined when you're owned. But we are definitely tied in a very real way to the health of that denomination. But we can't rely on that denomination. If the denomination continues to shrink, then they aren't sending us the number of students they used to. The financial strain, we actually receive a decent amount of funding from our denomination annually. There's lots of talk every time I go to the denominational meetings that should be reduced. The pressure and strain on the churches, it should be reduced. So as the churches send less and as the churches contribute less, the conversations revolve around, well, then to what degree should they be able to exercise control? If you are not affiliated, they have no control. If you're affiliated, they have a little control, maybe 50 plus one on the board. We're 2/3. We have to have a 1/3 laity and 1/3 clergy from the Wesleyan denomination on our board. I think the health is really important. But that just brings to light, though, the need for communication between the two entities. Reminding the churches, we are not a church.
Yeah.
We will have people here that we have to dismiss, that you get to allow to sit in your congregation every Sunday because they're just attending. but they're our employees. So we may have to dismiss somebody. We are an employer. We may have to dismiss a student that you might allow to come to your church multiple Sundays because they're merely attending. But here they've signed something and we have to hold them accountable. Likewise, we aren't focused solely on salvations and baptisms, although we do a lot of that. We have a mission that's academically driven and more intellectual than perhaps you. So that conversation has to go back and forth, and we got to start making more and more partners because we couldn't survive if we just relied on the denomination. For us, as an owned school by a denomination, the relationship is much more intimate, and therefore the communication has to be that much more thorough than perhaps other schools.
Thank you very much. Our guest has been Jon S. Kulaga, president of Indiana Wesleyan University. Thank you for taking the time to share your insights and wisdom with us.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Todd.
Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.